Russia would pay a severe price if they use chemical.
I will say this once. Ukraine does not have a biological weapons program.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Putin's immoral war, launched because he and his inner circle has some delusional dream of controlling free nations near his borders. It's a struggle for freedom in Ukraine against the dark forces of the Kremlin. Numerous cities are under siege. The Russian army shelling and bombing of civilian areas is horrendous. Mariupol, for instance, entire neighborhoods flattened by tank and artillery fire. People who have fled speak of dead bodies in the streets and the smell of death. Hell, they say. Kiev is the prime target. As Putin wants to remove the Ukrainian leadership, how can the Russians gain entry to a huge city guarded by tens of thousands of fighters? U.S. intelligence and NATO's chief say the Russians may use chemical or biological weapons. That's based on intelligence. They are preparing to do so. President Joe Biden, you just heard him, warned that Russia will pay a severe price if the country uses chemical weapons in Ukraine. I'm not going to speak about the intelligence, but Russia will pay a severe price if they use chemicals, he said. So on this backstory, Andy Weber and John Gower, two people who know everything about these horrendous weapons programs, and they have worked to abolish them. Decades spent campaigning for the destruction of chemical biological weapons of war. Unconventional weapons which shouldn't be deployed in any war zone by any army under any circumstances. So why does Russia have them? It's a long story, stretching back decades in the Soviet Union's evil empire. All right, Andy Weber is a former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense, and he is now with the Council on Strategic Risks. And John Gower is a retired Rear Admiral and was the Assistant Chief of Defense Staff for Nuclear and Chemical Biological in the UK Ministry of Defense, the MOD, and he is also a Senior Advisor with the Council on Strategic Risks. Hello to both of you.
Hello, Dana.
Firstly, if I can just start with, we're watching this horrific, very bloody assault on Ukraine, and I'm hearing voices like, former opposition figure Garry Kasparov challenging NATO's decision not to enter combat in Ukraine, questioning Putin's bluff on nuclear weapons, saying that the West has withered from President Putin's threats. Now, both of you have a lot of experience in terms of what the dire consequences would be if we got into a showdown with Russia and one that escalates out of our control. Can you address the great reticence now in the West and the prolonged questioning of why NATO is not putting boots on the ground or putting in a no-fly zone? Let's start with you, Andy.
Well, President Biden has been clear that we don't want to have direct combat with Russian forces, even in or over the territory of Ukraine, because that could escalate, in his words, to World War III. However, if Russia does escalate to the use of chemical or biological weapons, as seems possible based on recent intelligence that has been made public by the United Kingdom and the United States, we would reassess that position.
What intelligence is that? I mean, you're talking about the statements of Jens Stoltenberg from NATO saying that Russia could use chemical weapons in Ukraine. Is that what you're referring to?
No, I'm talking about recent intelligence that the UK Defense Secretary released saying that Russia is planning for a false flag chemical or biological weapons attack in Ukraine. That was released yesterday.
All right. John, do you want to just, address this? Do you think that we are over emphasizing and we are too worried about the use of non-conventional weapons by Russia, and that Putin is just using that to flatten Ukraine while he intimidates the West?
No, there's ample evidence of Putin's personal use of these weapons as assassination tools. He has, or the Soviet Union and Russia, before and during his time, has attempted 3 assassinations, one with a biological weapon, which was successful in the 1980s, one with a radiological source, which killed Litvinenko, and the attempted assassination of the Skripal family in Salisbury recently. So his personal predilection for these awful weapons of destruction at the individual level is proven. He's also, in the recent past, covered and assisted Assad, president of Syria, in his use of essentially the weapons program that was derived from the Russian program in the civil war in Syria. So his fingers are all over these weapons. We've seen him use chemical agents internally against his own people to break sieges and so-called terrorist activities. And there's very good intelligence that he used these weapons in the very similar brutal repression of Chechnya some years ago. So I think to assume anything else, that he is absolutely ready to do this, would be extremely foolish. And as the Defense Secretary made very clear, and other reports have, and has been throughout this brutal campaign against Ukraine, misinformation, both internally and externally, has been a major part of this.
So help us navigate that misinformation, and maybe I can ask Andy on that, because it is the Russians, including the Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who has said that the West and the U.S. are running labs in Ukraine, and that the West would use chemical weapons.
Yeah, I would just add to what Admiral Gower said, that although Putin has threatened the use of nuclear weapons, I think it's much more likely that he would use chemical and/or biological weapons in Ukraine. And we've responded to his nuclear threats with appropriate restraint. We don't want to allow this crisis to escalate to nuclear. But the Russian disinformation campaign, which is not new, although it has amped up significantly in recent weeks and days, and is being parroted by China, these ludicrous charges that the United States is supporting biological weapons work in Ukraine. Everyone knows that the United States ended its biological weapons program by order of President Nixon in 1969, and that Ukraine has never had a biological weapons program or a chemical weapons program. It's the Russians who've been in violation of both the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Biological Weapons Convention ever since the Soviet Union broke up. And they have 3 secret laboratories, military biological laboratories inside Russia that are part of their biological weapons program that have never been visited by foreign observers or inspectors. So they're deflecting blame, and it looks like they're preparing the ground to use these horrible weapons and blame it on the United States and Ukraine.
What weapons? I mean, what are they producing? What do you suspect is going on in those labs? And what would they potentially use in Ukraine? And you're saying it's likely now, not that there's a danger.
I'm saying it's more likely, and apparently we have intelligence to back up that they're planning this. It's more likely than using nuclear weapons. They do have a range of chemical weapons they can use, everything from industrial chemicals like chlorine to sarin, VX, and Novichok, a 4th-generation agent that they used in Salisbury. And biological weapons, they're most likely to use something that is not contagious human to human, something like anthrax.
And I think, if I may add to what Andy's said, the purpose of their false flagging, their misinformation campaign is twofold. Firstly, to provide a context behind which they can manufacture both internally and externally a rationale for these weapons, but also, as we saw in Syria, and as we have seen in the conventional end here, to blame those releases not on themselves, but on a failed attack or an inaccurate self problem from the so-called Ukrainian program that they have said is in existence. So this is twofold. It is pre-deflecting blame, but it is also providing the narrative which internally allows Putin to pass an order to his generals to do this, because of course Vladimir Putin's finger will not be on the launch button. And whilst it is right that everybody is pointing to the president for all of the ills in Ukraine, it is important to maintain that everybody under the chain of command, down to the commander, down to the private who is launching the artilleries at civilians today, who conducted the attack on the nuclear power generation plant in direct violation of one of the laws of armed combat, that should not take place. And every soldier and officer in the command chain who is part of an order to release chemical or biological weapons is individually responsible and will be found and tried ultimately in an international court. These are crimes against the law of armed conflict and against every convention which Russia has incidentally signed up to. And as Andy has clearly said, is in continuous violation thereof.
Why would Russia use chemical or biological weapons in the war in Ukraine? Andy?
Well, because they are weapons of terror. They are primarily weapons of terror because it is, you end up as dead as if you're hit by an artillery shell, but they have an extremely high level of terror for the population because you do not know, you do not hear them, you do not see them, and they kill in an atrociously awful way. And you watch people dying in a way that is infinitely worse. So for a start, they're very lethal, but they are particularly aimed at the terrorizing of civilians, and civilians in particular, because they have no protection against these weapons. The strange thing about using these weapons is, in fact, the people against which it is in any war, any proper war, legitimate for you to attack, the armed forces, are those that are protected against these weapons. So they are predominantly civilian killers and terrorizing weapons.
Andy, why would
I
they?
would add, yes, another reason I think they might use them is desperation. The vaunted Russian military is performing badly in combat in Ukraine, and they're increasingly desperate. So this would increase the chances that they'll reach for these horrific weapons of mass destruction, either chemical or biological, to try to turn the war around, which isn't going well for President Putin. He badly miscalculated with this reckless, unprovoked attack.
Why is the U.S. funding labs in Ukraine? How many are there, and what is in them?
Oh, I've been to all of the biological laboratories in Ukraine that the United States has supported since 2005. In fact, I helped create that program, and it's aimed at improving Ukraine Ministry of Health capabilities to detect, diagnose, and respond to infectious disease outbreaks, and the Ministry of Agriculture to respond to animal disease outbreaks. This is part of a system to strengthen early warning for disease outbreaks so we can prevent pandemics before they spread around the world. And I'm very proud of the work we've been doing in partnership with Ukraine in this area with their public health system. And it's proved invaluable during COVID for Ukrainian public health.
One of the questions was, do any of these labs have dangerous materials still in them? And should they be destroyed? And if they are dangerous, why was the U.S. helping Ukraine research and store that kind of material?
Well, first of all, I support the World Health Organization's suggestion that in anticipation of Russian attacks, that the culture collections in these laboratories should be destroyed to prevent a release into the environment or misuse by the Russian army. Some of them do contain samples of dangerous endemic diseases that are circulating in Ukraine, and it's legitimate, peaceful research to study and understand these diseases. But with the possibility of Russian bombing or direct attacks on these facilities, I would strongly hope that they're destroying their pathogen collections, which is fairly easy to do using either thermal treatment or essentially bleach.
I think it's important to add to that, Dana, that there isn't a country in Europe whose health organizations are not conducting this research in laboratories of their own and laboratories funded by the European Union or partially funded by the European Union. The only difference is none of those countries are under brutal attack from the air and from the land. And so, like Andy, the WHO has, I agree, the WHO has made a prudent request of the Ukrainian government that while it is under this brutal attack, it takes the precaution of destroying the small amounts of pathogens that are necessary for this research and equally small amounts of pathogens endemic in the countries around the world that conduct this research. This is not simply Ukraine. Everyone does it. The Russians do it as well.
Well, I think there is some distinctive elements of this. If I can ask Andy, because you've been in these labs, were any of them the former plague institutes where they sampled plagues and then they weaponized anthrax in the former Soviet Union into missiles that were aimed at London and New York and Chicago and elsewhere? There is some legacy there of the old Soviet program, is there not? And why was the US involved in that in terms of threat reduction?
So during the Soviet Union, there was an anti-plague system that consisted of 5 institutes and 40 field stations. And several of those field stations are located in Ukraine. The anti-plague system played an indirect role in identifying, collecting pathogens from nature, and then finding the most deadly, virulent strains and passing those into the hardcore biological weapons research and development facilities, which are in Russia and still operating today.
Okay, so to understand then, because you and I, when I was a reporter with another network, we walked through the anti-plague institutes in Kazakhstan, which I understand are similar to the ones in Ukraine. And threat reduction, the US threat reduction program at that time was then neutralizing these plague samples of anthrax and other things like tularemia and smallpox, and if I'm not mistaken. So you were neutralizing it under the threat reduction Nunn-Lugar program so that they would never be sold off to terrorists or they would never be weaponized against the United States or the West.
That's right, with the exception of smallpox, which is only in 2 laboratories, one in Siberia and the other in Atlanta, Georgia. But what we did early on was we consolidated these many pathogen collections around Ukraine, around Kazakhstan, into 1 or 2 facilities that we provided better security and better biological safety to reduce the risk of exploitation by terrorists.
I think it's also, if I may, it's also important that this was it's not only the physical dissolution of these satellites to the Russian program that was important. It was about providing an education and a further path to the scientists who were caught up in this program and were still resident in these countries. And what the
training scientists so that they wouldn't carry on this work for some other country.
Well, firstly, providing them with continued employment, because if their employment suddenly stopped and all they'd been doing was weaponizing pathogens, then they were available for hire. So that was very important. But also to provide a legacy for the current generation, who are younger scientists, that this is legitimate, positive, peaceful work in the biosphere that does not require you to look at the weaponization. You're looking at exactly the opposite sphere, and that is what these laboratories are doing today.
And Andy, the amount of anthrax that was being manufactured and weaponized in the former Soviet Union, on what kind of scale? I mean, you showed me a 7-story building in the steppes of Kazakhstan where they were blowing it into the warheads of Satan missiles. But the amount of anthrax that the former Soviet Union was producing was, you would never, I mean, you could poison the world hundreds of times over, could you not?
Absolutely. The scale of the Soviet Union biological weapons program, which was greatly expanded after the Biological Weapons Convention entered into force in 1975, was nothing short of evil. That one facility in Kazakhstan at Stepnogorsk, just over the Russian border, which we safely destroyed at the request of President Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan, that was capable of producing during a wartime mobilization period of about 8 months, 300 tons of anthrax agent. In addition, the Soviet army transported by rail and then ship and buried 100 to 150 tons of anthrax agent on Vozrождение Island in the Aral Sea, which was their open air biological weapons test ground. And we did a project with the government of Uzbekistan to dig up the 11 pits where it was buried because they still contained viable anthrax spores, and thoroughly decontaminated them just after 9/11.
I mean, it's pretty important what we're talking about is that the U.S. wasn't funding labs. The U.S. was going into the former Soviet Union, neutralizing these labs and weapons programs so that they didn't fall in the hands of terrorists, and also that they were eliminated from the new Russian programs. And they eliminated and retrained scientists. Do you, to wrap this up to both of you, do both of you fear that Putin has reconstituted these chemical biological weapons programs, and in talking about your fear that he might use a weapon, that he is producing a lot of what we don't know in Russia that is banned internationally now?
Yes, absolutely. We know he's reconstituted them, perhaps on a smaller scale, but his use of Novichok, advanced chemical weapons agent in Salisbury, is proof. It's the smoking gun that he's reconstituted his chemical weapons program. And the biological weapons program, the United States State Department has held that Russia is not in compliance with its treaty obligations under the Biological Weapons Convention, in part because these facilities remain secret and nobody outside of Russia has ever visited them. So we assume that they continue a very dangerous, illegal biological weapons work today.
John Gower?
Yes, it's important the Novichok is significant. During and at the end of the Second World War, all of the victorious allies gained elements of the Nazi program, which was far in advance of our own. And that is what kicked off the 50s and 60s programs that everybody then, during that madness, was running. When the Biological Weapons Convention and the Chemicals Weapons Conventions were signed, every nation apart from Russia ceased those programs and destroyed their stocks, or is in the process of so doing. What was critical about Novichok is it was the next generation. This was not part of the Nazi program that was just taken over by the Allies. This was continued research that went on beyond the date that Russia signed both of these conventions. It, as Andy says, it is the smoking gun that these programs exist and exist today. My personal belief is chemical weapons use is more likely than biological, but we cannot discount either of them, and I think both of them are highly likely.
John, what would be the response from the West, from NATO, from the UN, if they were to do the unthinkable and use chemical or biological like they did in Syria?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head. Syria was incredibly murky and complicated for several reasons. Firstly, it was extremely difficult to get access to the areas where the attacks, particularly in Quetta on the outskirts of Damascus, took place. There was a massive misinformation campaign led by the Russians and the Syrian government in order to muddy the waters as to who used the weapons and whether they were used at all. And that is, as we earlier said, that is already in place, this misinformation campaign. The Russian claims that the laboratories, which we discussed earlier, are engaged in offensive biological and chemical activity, is part of the smokescreen preparation for such an attack should it take place. So The challenge will be, as it was in Syria, to identify to a level of international agreement that these attacks took place. The difference, I think, between Syria and Ukraine at the moment is there is an awful lot more news coverage directly on the ground, and there is a lot more feed of verifiable data out of Ukraine.
There is right now.
There is right now, yes. But, with all the threat and risk and the daily deaths and mutilations of journalists that is going on, there is still today a very high coverage of what is going on. So what comes out of Russia television we have seen is state-suppressed propaganda. The rest of the world is seeing, as far as possible, the reality.
But
So
how does the West react to an attack? I mean, okay, let's say it is verifiable. Let's say they're able to say the Russians dropped that, a barrel bomb, or they can be traced to the attack. What should the West's response be at that point? Because it's really entering into chemical biological attack in Europe.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a more massive chemical biological attack, they've already taken place in the UK, as I said earlier, on 3 occasions. And indeed, they took place in Russia and in Chechnya in past decades. But this would be the first time a state-on-state attack, separate state attack. It is difficult to understand how the West would react. The opportunities, well, there are several options. The most likely one, in my judgment, given the statements that have been made already about the unwillingness to engage in a third world war, to use President Biden's terminology with Russia, is that it may not trigger kinetic response from the West. It may do so. And if it does so, that then ratchets right up into the area that President Putin has already threatened, the use of nuclear weapons. So by using these weapons, for which he is clearly preparing and for which he has shown the propensity to do, he will be driving the conflict into a completely different space. It's extremely reckless, brutal, and hazardous for him to even contemplate doing this.
John Gower, Andy Weber, thank you both. I hope you're both wrong that any of it is likely. But knowing what President Putin is willing to do, I tend to think you're right. But let's hope for the best, prepare for the worst.
I hope we're wrong. I hope we're wrong too, Dana. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I hope we're wrong. But if you start a sentence with President Putin wouldn't do ... that's a very brave sentence to say. Thank you for the opportunity to make this clear.
And that's our backstory on Russia's chemical, biological, and nuclear threat. Thanks to Andy Weber and John Gower. As a reporter, I remember walking through the anthrax weapons factory in Kazakhstan with Andy Weber and thinking to myself how mad the Cold War had become, and Soviet preparations to use these weapons after a nuclear exchange to kill off anyone still alive was madness, unthinkable. So would the deployment of chemical weapons now in the 21st century be just as crazy and immoral. But Russia's leader, Putin, has allowed chemical weapons to be used in Russia against his political opposition, and in Salisbury, England, and in Syria. He is capable, it seems, of doing so in Ukraine. It's frightening and inhuman. And the West needs to have a serious and immediate response if Putin does so, and expect him to deny it all. I'm Dana Lewis. Thanks for listening to Backstory. Please share the podcast, and I'll talk to you again soon.